Welcome. Okay, let's just dive right into this. We're actually going to skip the usual agenda today because for this explainer, I want to plunge you straight into the deep end. You see, philosophy doesn't really begin with clear-cut answers, right? It begins with impossible questions. It starts by taking the things we think we know and just flipping them completely upside down. So instead of some traditional, formal intro, we're going to start with a story. And I really want you to picture this as vividly as you can, because, well, it's literally a matter of life and death.
So, here's the scenario. Imagine you're the driver of a trolley car and you're hurtling down a track. All of a sudden, you realize the brakes have completely failed. And right ahead of you, on the main track, there are 5 workers. If you hit them, they are going to die. There is absolutely no way to stop this thing. But you notice a side track branching off to the right, and on that track, there is only 1 worker. Now your steering wheel, it still works. So you've got a split second. What do?
The stark, undeniable reality here really just boils down to cold, easy math, doesn't it? 5 lives versus 1 life. 5 grieving families versus just 1. And you know, when we're presented with this exact ratio, the choice, for most of us anyway, starts to feel like a tragic but kind of obvious necessity. It's terrible, obviously, but the math just seems to demand a certain action.
So I have to ask you directly, do you turn the wheel? Do you actively steer that trolley onto the side track, consciously choosing to kill the 1 worker just to save the 5? Well, if you're like most people, you probably immediately said yes. The reasoning feels incredibly simple and sound, right? It's far better to save 5 lives, even if the terrible cost is sacrificing 1. And this reaction? It reveals that we naturally operate on a principle based on consequences. In that split second, our internal logic dictates that the final result, the overall body count, is the thing that matters most.
But hey, let's test that logic a bit. Let's change the mechanics of the choice. You're no longer the driver. Now you're a bystander standing on a bridge overlooking the track. The exact same runaway trolley is heading toward the exact same 5 workers. But this time, standing right next to you on the bridge is a very large man. And the only way to stop the trolley and save those 5 workers is to push this man off the bridge. His body will land on the track, it'll stop the trolley, saving the 5, but he'll die. So, do you push him? Suddenly, almost everyone hesitates. Very few people would actually push the man. And this brilliantly illustrates the central puzzle we're exploring today. I mean, what just happened to our firm, rock-solid principle of save the 5? In the first scenario, we acted decisively. In the second, we recoil. Why is that? Well, pulling a lever to change tracks, that feels like a tragic side effect. But pushing a person with your bare hands, that feels like a direct act of murder. But is there really a moral difference? In both cases, the math is exactly the same. And in both cases, you are the one choosing who lives and who dies. That friction between your first choice and your second choice, it exposes the fault lines in our moral logic.
To really understand why we feel so torn, we need to step back from the tracks for a second and actually give a name to these instincts. That hesitation you just felt introduces us to the 2 foundational pillars of moral philosophy. The first one is what drove your initial decision to steer the trolley. It's called consequentialist reasoning. Simply put, consequentialism dictates that morality depends entirely on the outcome of an action. If the end result is better, like, 5 people surviving instead of 1, then the action is totally morally justified. Under this view, the consequences are literally the only things that carry moral weight.
Now, the most famous champion of this consequentialist view was an 18th century philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. He argued for a specific type of consequentialism that you've probably heard of, utilitarianism. His defining metric was incredibly straightforward: the greatest good for the greatest number. Bentham basically believed that all moral choices are just a calculus of maximizing utility, meaning finding the absolute best possible balance of pleasure over pain, or in our trolley case, life over death. If an action increases the overall happiness or survival rate of the group, boom, it's the right thing to do.
But here's the catch. Bentham's math doesn't actually explain why we wouldn't push the man off the bridge. For that, we need the opposing viewpoint, which was championed by philosophers like Immanuel Kant. This is known as categorical reasoning. So under categorical reasoning, morality depends on the nature of the act itself, entirely regardless of the consequences. This view argues that certain actions, like, say, directly pushing an innocent person to their death, are just fundamentally categorically wrong. Even if pushing that man saves 5 lives, the act of murder cannot be justified by a positive outcome. The ends simply do not justify the means.
Okay, moving on to part 1, the lifeboat case, the Queen versus Dudley and Stephens. Let's pull these philosophies out of the realm of hypothetical stick figures for a minute
and apply them to a grim, real-world historical case of survival. Just let the reality of this timeline sink in. 4 sailors are shipwrecked in a tiny lifeboat, adrift in the vast ocean. They have absolutely no food. Among them is a cabin boy, a 17-year-old orphan who drank seawater, became violently sick, and is hovering near death. They endure this unimaginable agony for 19 days. And on that 19th day, the captain, Dudley, and the first mate, Stephens, make a horrific decision. They decide to kill the sick cabin boy. They consume his body to survive, and then the ultimate tragic irony. Just 4 days later, they are rescued.
So, upon their return to civilization, the captain and first mate were put on trial for murder. Their primary defense? The doctrine of necessity. They essentially argued Bentham's math right there in a court of law. They said, look, better 1 die so 3 can survive. If you apply that consequentialist calculus, on one side you have 3 surviving men who are pillars of society, with wives and children depending on them. On the other side you have 1 single cabin boy, an orphan with no family who is already sick and likely to die anyway. If you strictly calculate the total human happiness and societal value, they argued, will sacrificing the boy maximize the overall good?
Despite the brutal logic of that survival math, when the public heard this story back then, and honestly even when we hear it today, there is just a visceral, immediate rejection of what happened. It just feels deeply, inherently wrong. But why, exactly? When we break down that feeling of outrage, 3 distinct moral objections emerge against this lifeboat cannibalism. First up, the categorical objection. Second, an objection regarding procedure. And third, an objection regarding consent. Let's examine each of these and see what they actually reveal about our sense of justice.
All right, the first objection really just boils down to this. Murder is murder. This is the categorical argument in action. It asks a pretty profound question. Do we as human beings possess fundamental rights that simply cannot be traded away for the greater good? If taking an innocent life is always wrong, then absolutely no amount of consequentialist math, no matter how many wives and children the other sailors had, can ever justify slaughtering that cabin boy. This asks us to consider, where do these unalienable rights come from, if they exist entirely independent of the community's overall happiness? The second objection shifts our focus over to the process itself. Think about it. What if the sailors hadn't just singled out the weakest among them? What if they had all agreed to hold a lottery, drawing straws, so that everyone faced an exact equal risk of being sacrificed? If they had used a fair procedure, would the outcome have been morally acceptable to us? This forces us to ask, does a fair agreement, a level playing field in the decision-making process, miraculously justify a completely horrific outcome? Why do we put so much moral weight on this idea of a fair procedure?
And that brings us to the third objection, which raises a final, incredibly complex question. What if the cabin boy had actually agreed to be the sacrifice? What if, knowing he was dying anyway, he gave his permission so the others could live? If he had consented, would the captain and first mate still be considered murderers, or would they suddenly be heroes? This really challenges us to figure out exactly what moral work consent actually does. I mean, how can an act that is undeniably wrong without consent suddenly become legally and morally permissible just because someone agreed to it?
Now you might be sitting there thinking, okay, philosophers have been debating these hypotheticals and historical cases for centuries without a clear resolution, so why even bother? Why tie our brains in knots over trolleys and lifeboats? Well, the answer is that we live the answers to these questions every single day. Every time a government allocates healthcare resources, or every time a self-driving car is programmed to avoid a crash, we are out there doing Bentham's math or relying on Kant's categorical rights. As Immanuel Kant himself so beautifully put it, skepticism is a resting place, but it is no permanent home for reason. The goal of this explainer wasn't to hand you the ultimate answer on a silver platter. It was to awaken that restlessness of your reason, to make the familiar feel strange, and challenge you to see exactly where that newfound perspective leads you.
So, as we wrap up our analysis today, I want to leave you right back where we started, but hopefully looking through a slightly different lens. You're back at the tracks. The trolley is coming. You know the math. You know the frameworks of consequences and categorical rights, and you know the burden of the lifeboat. Having wrestled with all of this, what do you truly believe is the right thing to do? Do you pull the lever, or do you push the man? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning everything.